John had always prided himself on being a rational man. He approached life with a calm, measured demeanor, and his marriage to Emily was no exception. For 6 years, he believed they had built something solid, something unshakable. They weren't perfect, no one was, but their connection felt genuine. When Emily told him she was pregnant, John had cried tears of joy, overwhelmed by the thought of becoming a father. The months that followed were a whirlwind of baby showers, nursery preparation, and late-night conversations about their future. When their son Ethan was born, John's heart felt fuller than ever. He held the tiny baby in his arms and whispered promises of love and protection. The sleepless nights and endless diaper changes were exhausting, but John relished every moment. He loved Emily even more for the way she cared for their son, and it all started to unravel in the most mundane way possible, a routine blood test. Ethan was just 6 months old when the pediatrician recommended a screening to check for potential allergies. John didn't think much of it. It was a standard procedure, a formality. But when the results came back, something caught his eye. John had a basic understanding of blood types. He knew his own O negative, and he knew Emily's was AB. According to simple biology, their child should have either A or B blood, but Ethan's results showed he had type AB. It was a small inconsistency, one that might have been dismissed by someone less analytical. But John's mind couldn't let it go. He told himself it was probably a mistake, a clerical error, yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew faster than he could control. Over the next few days, John became consumed by the need to know the truth. He tried to act normal, but he could feel the strain creeping into his interactions with Emily. He would catch himself staring at Ethan, searching for traces of his own features in the baby's face. Emily noticed his distracted demeanor and asked if everything was okay. John lied, saying work had been stressful. She accepted the explanation without pressing further, but finally, unable to silence the voice in his head, John decided to take action. One afternoon, while Emily was out running errands, he swabbed the inside of Ethan's cheek and carefully placed the sample in a DNA testing kit he had ordered online. He mailed it off the same day, feeling both ashamed and relieved. The waiting period was excruciating. Every time Emily smiled at him or handed him Ethan for a cuddle, John felt like he was betraying them both. When the results arrived 2 weeks later, John almost couldn't bring himself to open the email. His hands trembled as he clicked on the message, and his breath caught in his throat as he read the words on the screen. Ethan was not his biological son. The room seemed to tilt around him. His first thought was that there had been a mistake, but the science was irrefutable. The test confirmed with 99.9% accuracy that John was not Ethan's father. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the past year. Emily's pregnancy, the birth, the sleepless nights. It had all been a lie. John sat in silence for what felt like hours. Anger, betrayal, and heartbreak surged through him in waves, but beneath it all was a crushing sense of loss. Ethan was the light of his life, the little boy who had made him believe in something bigger than himself. And now, he wasn't sure what to feel. That evening, John forced himself to act normal. He played with Ethan, kissed Emily goodnight, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, he was unraveling. He spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, as questions swirled in his mind. Who was the father? How long had Emily been unfaithful? Did she even love him, or had their entire relationship been a facade? The next day, John called in sick to work. He needed time to process, to think. He couldn't confront Emily without a plan. He had no idea how she would react, and he didn't want to risk losing Ethan without securing his own position first. Though the child wasn't biologically his, John had been the one raising him. He had been there for every milestone, every sleepless night. He couldn't imagine walking away from that, no matter what the circumstances were. John's mind oscillated between rage and despair. There were moments when he wanted to confront Emily immediately. to demand answers and watch her squirm under the weight of her lies. But then he would look at Ethan and feel an overwhelming sadness. He couldn't bring himself to tear apart their family without considering the consequences. As the days turned into weeks, John began to notice things he hadn't paid attention to before. Emily's behavior, once comforting in its familiarity, now seemed laced with secrets. She was always protective of her phone, often stepping out of the room to take calls. She occasionally mentioned staying late at work, something John had never questioned before. Now, every detail seemed suspicious. One evening, while Emily was bathing Ethan, John took the opportunity to check her phone. His hands shook as he scrolled through her messages, searching for any signs of infidelity. Most of the conversations were innocuous, chats with friends and family, but then he stumbled upon a thread with a coworker named Mark. The messages weren't overtly romantic, but there was an intimacy to their tone that made John's stomach turn. There were jokes, late-night exchanges, and mentions of work trips that John didn't remember Emily telling him about. One message in particular stood out. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You always make everything better." John felt like he'd been punched in the gut. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. Mark had to be Ethan's biological father. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for a moment, he struggled to breathe. But even then, John didn't confront Emily. He needed more time, more evidence. He couldn't risk her denying everything or turning the situation against him. Instead, he decided to bide his time and plan his next move carefully. For the first time in their marriage, John began keeping secrets of his own. He started documenting everything: copies of the paternity test, screenshots of Emily's messages, and notes about her behavior. He even consulted a lawyer to understand his rights and what steps he could take to protect himself and Ethan. Despite the growing tension in his heart, John continued to play the role of a loving husband and father. He laughed at Emily's jokes, doted on Ethan, and acted as though nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, he was a man on the brink, quietly preparing for the day when everything would come crashing down. The days following John's discovery were some of the hardest of his life. Every moment felt like he was walking on the edge of a knife, his emotions teetering between overwhelming sadness and simmering anger. Yet, through it all, he knew he couldn't act impulsively. Confronting Emily without a plan might give her the upper hand, and John had no intention of losing the little stability he still clung to. Instead, he threw himself into uncovering the full truth. Who exactly was Mark? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, was Emily still seeing him? John needed answers, not just for closure, but to decide how to move forward. The first step was to dig deeper into Emily's relationship with Mark. John recalled hearing about him casually over the years. Mark was her colleague at work, someone she occasionally mentioned in passing. He worked in the same department and, according to Emily, was a dependable team player. The way she had spoken about him always seemed benign, almost professional. But now, with the context of Ethan's parentage, John realized he had been blind to subtle clues. John started small. He searched for Mark on social media, quickly finding his profiles. Mark was in his late 30s, tall and well-dressed, with a confident smile that John immediately disliked. Scrolling through Mark's photos, John noted how many included Emily. There were group pictures from office events and team outings where they stood next to each other, laughing and relaxed. One photo in particular made John's stomach churn. A candid shot of Mark with his arm draped casually over Emily's shoulder. The more John uncovered, the more certain he became. This wasn't a fleeting mistake or a single moment of weakness. Emily and Mark had a connection, one that likely extended far beyond work. But John needed confirmation, something irrefutable. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, John took her phone again. This time, he focused on her calendar and email. As he sifted through entries, he noticed a pattern. There were several work dinners and strategy meetings scheduled late in the evenings, often at restaurants or hotels. None of these events had ever seemed suspicious before, but now John saw them in a new light. His suspicions deepened when he checked her ride-sharing app. He saw trips to locations far from her office, often at odd hours. A few were to Mark's neighborhood. Others ended near hotels that John recognized from her calendar entries. The pieces were falling into place, but John felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had hoped, against all logic, that he was wrong. The next step in John's investigation required more than just passive observation. He needed to know if Emily was still seeing Mark. It was a painful thought, imagining her meeting him in secret while pretending everything was fine at home. But John had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. One Friday, Emily told John she would be working late to prepare for an important presentation. It was a plausible excuse, one she had used before. But this time, John decided to follow her. After she left the house, dressed in her usual business attire, John waited 10 minutes before grabbing his car keys and heading out. He parked a few blocks from her office and watched from a distance. Sure enough, after about an hour, Emily emerged from the building, but she wasn't alone. Mark was with her. They walked side by side, talking animatedly, their body language comfortable and familiar. John followed them discreetly as they made their way to a nearby restaurant. It wasn't a casual diner or a quick coffee shop. It was an upscale place, the kind of venue reserved for special occasions. From where he was parked, John could see them through the window. They were seated in a cozy corner booth, leaning in close as they talked. The sight was like a punch to the gut. Seeing Emily smile at Mark the way she used to smile at him brought a fresh wave of pain. John had to grip the steering wheel to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. But he didn't act. He couldn't risk confronting them in public or letting his emotions get the better of him. Instead, he took out his phone and snapped a few photos, documenting their meeting. After dinner, John continued to follow them as they left the restaurant. To his dismay, they didn't part ways. Instead, they walked to a nearby hotel. John watched as they entered the lobby together, and his heart shattered. This wasn't just an emotional affair or a lingering connection. It was physical. When John returned home that night, he felt hollow. The house, once a place of love and comfort, now felt suffocating. He sat in the living room staring at the photos on his phone. He wanted to scream, to cry, to confront Emily the moment she walked through the door. But he didn't. Instead, he reminded himself of his plan. He couldn't let anger dictate his actions. The following morning, Emily acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed John on the cheek, thanked him for looking after Ethan, and went about her usual routine. Her casual demeanor only deepened John's resolve. He spent the next few days focusing on gathering evidence. He printed the photos he had taken, documented Emily's suspicious calendar entries, and made a timeline of events. He also contacted his lawyer again, this time sharing what he had discovered. The lawyer advised John to continue documenting everything, but cautioned him against making any rash moves. As painful as it was, John began to emotionally detach from Emily. He still played the role of a loving husband for Ethan's sake, but his interactions with her were increasingly mechanical. He no longer reached for her hand or kissed her goodnight. Emily seemed to notice the change, but didn't press him about it. John wondered if she was too preoccupied with Mark to care. One evening, while Ethan was asleep, John sat alone in the nursery. He held one of Ethan's tiny socks in his hand, tears streaming down his face. Ethan wasn't his biological child, but John loved him more than anything. The thought of losing him was unbearable. It was this love that kept John going, that gave him the strength to continue his quiet investigation. By the end of the second chapter of his journey, John had uncovered nearly everything he needed to confront Emily. He knew the who, the when, and the how. All that remained was deciding what to do with the truth. Would he forgive her, try to salvage their marriage for Ethan's sake, or would he expose her lies and walk away? For now, John kept his plans to himself. He knew the storm was coming, but he refused to face it unprepared. John couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in two parallel realities. In one, he was still the devoted husband and father, deeply entwined in his family's life, helping with Ethan's late-night feedings, attending doctor's appointments with Emily, and planning for the future together. In the other, he was a detective, meticulously piecing together the truth about Emily's affair with Mark. The two realities clashed constantly, each one fighting for dominance. But with every passing day, the detective within John grew stronger. He couldn't allow his emotions to cloud his judgment. If he wanted justice, he had to remain clear-headed and methodical. It was time to start making moves. First, John needed to confirm exactly how deep Emily's betrayal went. He couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. Was this just an affair, or was it something more serious? From everything he had observed, it seemed like Mark was deeply embedded in Emily's life. Were they falling in love? Were they planning to build something together beyond just an illicit fling? To find out, John needed to be bold. He started by planting small devices around their house. Hidden cameras disguised as clocks, motion-activated voice recorders, even tiny GPS trackers discreetly tucked in Emily's car. At first, it felt intrusive, almost unnatural. But John told himself it was necessary to protect himself and Ethan. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about safeguarding his future. As days turned into weeks, John began receiving the recordings. The footage and audio from those devices were eye-opening, but they weren't all damning. Most of the conversations between Emily and Mark seemed innocuous on the surface, discussions about work, plans for upcoming deadlines, and mundane family updates. It was easy for someone on the outside to dismiss them as professional interactions. But John knew better. There were subtleties in the way they spoke to each other. Little touches on the arm, lingering glances, the unmistakable chemistry that radiated between them. It was all too familiar to John, who had once felt that same spark with Emily. It became evident that this wasn't just a fling, it was an ongoing affair, something they both actively cultivated in secret. One evening, John stumbled upon something more incriminating. It was a late-night conversation between Emily and Mark, recorded while they believed they were alone. They were talking about their plans, what they wanted in the future, how they both felt suffocated in their current situations. Emily spoke with a longing in her voice, confessing that she felt more alive with Mark than she had in years. Mark echoed her sentiments, speaking about their freedom from their current lives and how much they wanted to be together. John's chest tightened as he listened. It wasn't just an affair. It was becoming something dangerously close to a full-blown emotional entanglement, something that involved deep commitment and shared dreams. The idea of Emily building a future with another man while married to him made John's blood boil. But what made his skin crawl the most was the undercurrent of cruelty in their words. Emily had once told John how unhappy she had been in their marriage, how she had felt suffocated by the responsibilities of parenthood and home life. John had tried to understand, tried to be patient, but now it was clear that it had all been a smokescreen, a manipulation designed to soften her betrayal. The next set of recordings confirmed what John had feared. One evening, while Emily was still asleep, Mark sent her a message. "Tonight will be perfect. Let's pick up where we left off." John's jaw clenched as he read it. He already knew what picking up where they left off meant. More secret meetings, more stolen moments in dark corners where no one could see. The more John uncovered, the more he became convinced that Emily was playing a dangerous game. A game that carried consequences far beyond their personal pain. She wasn't just betraying him. She was destroying their family's trust, their unity, their future. And in Mark, she had found someone who fed her fantasies, someone who enabled her to escape the life they had built together. John's lawyer had cautioned him about taking hasty action. He knew divorce was the legal option, but that wouldn't fix everything. He wasn't just after legal retribution. he needed to ensure that Ethan wouldn't suffer in the fallout. John couldn't let his son pay the price for Emily's selfish choices, so he continued gathering evidence, methodically building a case that would serve both his justice and his child's well-being. But the more John watched, the more conflicted he felt. How could he prove to Emily that he wasn't just reacting out of anger? Could he show her, through the cold, hard truth, that he still cared enough to fight for their family? Or would this all simply end in a bitter separation? The more he dug, the clearer it became that Emily had not been entirely honest with him for a long time. It wasn't just about Mark. John realized now that the cracks in their marriage had started long before Ethan was born. She had been withdrawing, pulling away, giving more of herself to work and friends, always avoiding deeper conversations. John had tried to reach her, tried to rekindle the flame that once burned between them, but she had been retreating into her own world. And yet, deep down, John still loved her, or at least, he thought he did. It was confusing, painful. Love and betrayal had become so intertwined that he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He hated what she had done, but part of him still longed for the woman he married, the woman who had promised to stand by his side forever. But John knew he couldn't wait much longer. Time was slipping away, and every moment that passed was another opportunity for Mark to strengthen his foothold in Emily's life. John needed to act before it was too late. Still, he wanted to ensure that Emily's betrayal was undeniable, no room for argument, no chance to twist the situation to her favor. So he reached out to a trusted friend, someone he had known for years, an investigator with access to surveillance and resources that John didn't have. It wasn't just a favor, it was a business arrangement, one that John was prepared to pay whatever it. The investigator went to work quickly, digging into Mark's life, uncovering more information about his connections and habits. It didn't take long before John received a set of incriminating photographs. Snapshots of Mark and Emily meeting late at night, leaving hotels hand in hand, looking too familiar, too intimate. John held the pictures in his hands, his heart pounding. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was cold, calculating. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. It was about protecting everything that mattered to him. As he continued gathering more evidence, John realized something else. Emily hadn't just been sneaking around with Mark. She had also been preparing for something. There were emails between her and someone at work, discussing her next steps, planning a possible relocation, talking about how to start fresh. The pieces were falling into place. Emily wasn't just having an affair. She was planning a way out. It became clear to John, Emily wasn't just betraying him. She was actively seeking to dismantle their lives, to create a new future where she could be free to be with Mark. That realization was the final nail in the coffin. John could no longer pretend that this was a small mistake or something that could be fixed with conversation. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a full-blown plan to take everything from him. John's mind was made up. He would confront Emily, but not recklessly, not blindly. He would gather every piece of evidence he needed, and then he would execute his plan, methodically, carefully. He wouldn't let emotions drive his decisions anymore. The day had finally come. The day John had been preparing for. After weeks of gathering evidence, meticulously piecing together the truth about Emily's affair with Mark, he knew there was no more time to wait. The longer he delayed, the more entrenched their relationship would become, and the more control Emily would exert over their lives. John had reached his limit, and now he was ready to confront her. The house was eerily quiet that morning. Ethan was at daycare as usual, and Emily had already left for work. John stood in the kitchen, brewing a cup of coffee, the faint hum of the household appliances barely audible. He stared at the tablet in his hand, which displayed the most damning photos, the ones his investigator had gathered. Pictures of Emily and Mark taken at various times, entering hotels together, sharing whispered conversations, and looking far too comfortable in each other's presence. The images told the whole story. They had grown close, too close, closer than they had any right to be while John had remained in the dark. John knew this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a full-blown scheme. Emily had been building a future with Mark, actively planning to leave their life behind. The text messages between them, the late-night rendezvous, the discussions about relocating, they were all proof that Emily wasn't just seeking solace outside of her marriage. She was building something new entirely. But now he was done hiding in the shadows. The waiting was over. It was time to face Emily head-on and force her to answer for what she had done. That evening, John arrived home after work with purpose. The tension in the air was palpable, heavier than usual. Ethan's toys were scattered on the living room floor, but John barely noticed them. His mind was focused, sharpened by the evidence he had uncovered. Emily returned a few hours later, breezing in as if nothing had changed. She greeted him with a casual kiss on the cheek, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind John's composed exterior. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, setting her briefcase down by the door. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a tablet gently on the kitchen table, where she would see it when she walked past. Emily glanced at the screen, her eyes narrowing slightly. At first, she thought it was just a random news story or an article he'd saved, but then she saw the photos. Her smile faltered as her gaze drifted over the screen, her mouth opening slightly. What is this?" she asked, frowning. "I think you know what it is," John said, his voice calm but firm, betraying none of the storm building inside him. Emily picked up the tablet, scrolling through the images, her face turning pale. The photos of her and Mark together, coming out of hotels, whispering in corners, laughing, were undeniable. She tried to maintain a composed facade, but the color in her face drained away. "What is this, John?" she asked again, her voice trembling slightly. John inhaled deeply and let the silence stretch for a beat. He wasn't about to give her a chance to twist the situation. He had spent too long gathering this evidence, too long planning what he was going to say. He had already weighed the consequences, and now it was time for the truth to come out. "I think you know exactly what it is," he repeated, this time more firmly. "These photos, they show you, Emily, with Mark. You didn't just work late or have strategy meetings. You've been meeting him in secret. You've been carrying on an affair behind my back." Emily's hands tightened around the tablet, her knuckles going white. Her eyes darted around the kitchen as if searching for an escape, some way to deny it all, to rationalize her actions. But there was no denying the truth now. "John, it's not what you think," she began, her voice faltering. "No, then what is it, Emily?" John cut her off. "Is it just innocent meetings? Is that what you want to tell me? Because you've been planning something else entirely. You've been talking to him about your future, about leaving us, about leaving me and Ethan." Emily's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected John to know so much, but there was no denying it anymore, not with the evidence right in front of her. "Please, John, I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered. "Didn't mean for it to get this far?" John scoffed, his voice rising. "You didn't mean for it? You didn't mean for it to get to the point where you're spending nights with him? You didn't mean for it to get to the point where you're discussing leaving your family? Tell me, Emily, how long have you been planning this?" Emily's eyes flicked down to the table, unable to meet his gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked lost, cornered, everything she had built over the past few months crumbling before her. I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally murmured. "Didn't mean for it," John repeated, his voice icy now. "You didn't mean for it. Or was it just easier for you to pretend you were unhappy, to make me feel like I wasn't enough for you? Was it easier to blame me instead of taking responsibility? I thought I was unhappy, Emily said softly, tears welling in her eyes. John, I didn't mean for any of this to hurt you. But it did, John interrupted. It hurt me. And it hurt Ethan. You didn't think about that, did you? You didn't think about the damage you were causing, how much this would destroy our family. I didn't plan for any of this to get out of hand, Emily whispered, desperately trying to salvage something. I thought I could fix things. I thought you weren't happy either. John felt a surge of anger, but he tempered it. He couldn't let emotions take control. This wasn't about revenge. This was about facing the reality they had created together. I wasn't happy, Emily, but I thought we could work through it. I thought we could talk. I thought we were in this together. I love you, Emily said quickly, almost as though repeating it could make it true again. I love you both, John. I swear I do. John's expression darkened. You say that now, but your actions don't reflect that love. You've been willing to throw it all away, me, Ethan, everything, for something that's temporary and selfish, and you knew it. You knew what you were doing. Emily's tears fell freely now, but John's heart was too hardened by what he had seen, by what he had learned, to feel any pity. He had tried to ignore the signs, to believe in her, but now it was impossible to turn a blind eye any longer. You think this ends here? John finally said, his voice cutting through the silence. Because it doesn't. This is far from over, Emily. I'm not going to let you walk away from us so easily. What do you mean? She asked, bewildered. You're not just walking away, Emily. You're going to have to answer for this. You're going to have to face what you've done. Not just to me, but to Ethan too. Because this isn't just a mistake. This is a choice. And you made it. Emily shook her head, desperately trying to deny it all, but John wouldn't let her. He had reached his limit, and he had nothing left to lose. I'll make sure Ethan knows the truth, he said coldly. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. And if you think Mark can give you a better life, then fine, go ahead and try. But know this. Once you make your choice, you won't come back. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. She realized, finally, that there was no saving what they had. Everything she had built with John, everything she had once cherished, had been shattered by her own choices, and now it was too late. John turned away, walking toward the door, leaving Emily standing in stunned silence, the truth hanging heavy in the air between them. He knew the fight had just begun, the fight for their family, for Ethan's future, and for his own peace. But for Emily, there was no easy escape. The affair was exposed, the betrayal undeniable, and the consequences looming large. And John wouldn't let her forget it.